400 Hells Angels lining the gravel road outside a county group home at sunrise was not something the town of Ash Fork, Arizona had ever seen before, especially not for a skinny 10-year-old nobody in that town had ever bothered to learn the name of. But it all started 3 days earlier, on the shoulder of a desert highway, when an orphan boy with nothing of his own found something that belonged to a stranger and decided to give back 3 days he could not afford to lose. He found a dog, a big shepherd, ribs showing, dragging a snapped leash, limping along the broken white line of Route 89 in the kind of heat that kills. Most people had driven past it. The boy did not have a car to drive. He had 2 feet and an empty stomach, and 3 days before the people at the home would even notice he was gone. And he looked at that frightened animal, and he made a choice that 400 grown men would later say they could not have made themselves. He decided to find its owner, however long it took. The Coronado County Children's Home sat at the dry edge of Ash Fork, where the pavement turned to gravel and the desert took over. It was a long, low building the color of dust, with a chain-link fence and a flag on a bent pole and an air conditioner that worked in some rooms and not others. The smell of industrial cleaner and dry heat hung in the hallways. A television played somewhere down a corridor, the volume up too loud, the way it gets in places where nobody is really listening. This was the kind of home that had been built for 40 children and now held 60, where the staff were tired and underpaid and not unkind, just stretched so thin that a quiet child could go a long time without anyone truly seeing him. And there was one boy there who had learned to be very quiet. His name was Theo. He was 10 years old, small for it, all elbows and knees, with a buzz-cut grown-out shaggy because nobody had taken him for a haircut in a while. He had been at the home for 2 years, since the accident that took both his parents on a wet road outside Flagstaff, an accident he had survived in the back seat and did not talk about. He did not have much: a few shirts, a pair of sneakers held together with tape, and one photograph, soft and creased from handling, of 2 people and a smaller version of himself, which he kept in his shirt pocket and took out at night when the dormitory had gone dark. Theo had learned the thing that orphan children learn, which is that wanting something is dangerous because the world has already shown you it can take anything away. So he had stopped wanting much. He kept his head down, he did not make trouble, and he had a small private habit, when he was nervous, of pressing the photograph flat through the fabric of his pocket, just to feel that it was still there. But there was one thing nobody at the home knew about Theo. Before the accident, when he was small and his life still had a shape, there had been a dog, a big shepherd named Bingo, who slept across the foot of his bed and met the school bus every afternoon. The dog had been given away after the accident, in the chaos, the way everything had been given away, and Theo had never been told where. He had grieved that dog almost as hard as he grieved the rest of it, because a dog was a thing a small boy could hold on a night when there was nothing else to hold. Before we go any further, do me one favor, hit subscribe, and drop your hometown in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one. Now, back to Theo and the frightened dog on the side of the desert highway. Because what that boy was about to do over the next 3 days would reach a great deal further than he ever imagined. The dog belonged to a man named Dutch Halloran, and Dutch was not a small presence anywhere he went. He was 51, built wide and weathered, with a gray beard and a back patch that read Hells Angels across the top rocker. He had ridden with the Arizona Charter for nearly 30 years, and people stepped back when Dutch came into a room, the way they always had. But the thing most people did not know about Dutch Halloran was that the shepherd was the only family he had left. Her name was Sadie. He had ridden 10,000 miles with that dog in a sidecar, her ears pinned back in the wind, and 3 days ago at a gas station off Route 89, a backfiring truck had spooked her and she had bolted into the desert before Dutch could grab her. And he had spent 72 hours riding grid lines across that country with his heart in his throat, certain the heat or the coyotes had already taken her. He carried the way some men carry a stone in a coat pocket, the quiet weight of a life that had narrowed down to one living thing that loved him. He had a brother once, a real one, blood, who had died young and left Dutch the kind of grief that does not heal so much as harden. He had been married a long time ago, before the road took him all the way. There were no children. There was a long line of years and a longer line of highway, and at the end of it, when most of the people were gone, there was a shepherd named Sadie who slept against his back at night and rode in his sidecar by day and asked nothing of him but to not be left behind. That was his whole family now, the sum total of it, 80 pounds of dog. And he had no idea, none at all, that 40 miles away a 10-year-old orphan had found her on the white line and was already walking. It was not an easy 3 days. The boy had no money and no car and no plan except the tag on the dog's collar, which had a name, Sadie, and a phone number worn down past reading by 10,000 miles of road. So Theo did it the only way a child could. He got the dog into the shade. He gave her half of the one sandwich he had taken from the home's kitchen, and then the other half the next day, and went hungry himself. He found a hose behind a closed feed store and cupped water in his hands until she drank, and he walked her town to town along the shoulder of the highway, showing the worn collar to anyone who would slow down long enough to look. This is where the world showed Theo what it had already shown him too many times, because almost nobody slowed down. A gas station clerk told him to take the stray somewhere else. This wasn't a shelter. A man in a truck rolled his window down, looked at a dirty kid with a limping dog, decided it was somebody else's problem, and rolled it back up. The county shelter was closed for the weekend, the number on the door ringing out to a machine. A woman crossed the street to avoid them, steering her own child away by the shoulder. 40 cars passed in an afternoon, and 40 cars kept going. Nobody was cruel. Exactly. They were just busy, just somewhere else in their heads, just certain that a child and a dog on the side of a road were not their concern. That is the quietest kind of cruelty there is, the kind that wears no face and answers to no name, the kind a boy like Theo had already learned to expect from the world. He tried the right things too, the things a child is taught to try. He found a police station in one town and stood in the lobby with the dog. And a tired officer behind the glass told him, "Animal control opened Monday and a kid shouldn't have a dog like that in here." And Theo said thank you and left, because he had learned not to argue with the people behind the glass. He tried a vet's office, and they were kind, but they were closing. And they gave him a cup of water and a dog biscuit, and a number that turned out to be the same closed shelter. Every door a child is told to knock on, he knocked on, and every door did what doors had been doing to Theo his whole life, which was to stay mostly shut. But Theo did not stop. He had decided, in whatever fierce small place a grieving child keeps his decisions, that this dog was not going to be one more thing that got lost because nobody bothered. He slept the first night in a culvert with the dog curled against him for warmth, because the desert that bakes you by day will freeze you after dark. And he lay awake, listening to coyotes, and kept one hand wound in the dog's fur so she would not bolt again. He slept the second night behind a laundromat on warm concrete that smelled of dryer sheets, the dog between him and the dark. By the third day, his lips had cracked and his shoulders had burned and peeled, and his hands had started to shake from hunger because he had given the dog the last of the food 2 days back. He kept the photograph pressed flat in his pocket, and he kept walking, and he kept showing the worn collar to anyone who would slow down. And at last, footsore and swaying, he walked into the parking lot of a roadhouse on the edge of Ash Fork, because there were motorcycles outside it, a lot of them, and he had run out of other ideas. He did not know it was a Hells Angels charter meeting. He only knew that bikers and dogs seemed to go together, and that he was out of road. A man at the door, a big one, looked down at the dirty kid and the limping shepherd, and started to tell him this was a private event. And then he looked at the dog again. He looked at her face, and at the gray on her muzzle, and at the worn-down collar, and something changed in him. Because every man in that roadhouse knew that dog. They had ridden with her. They had watched Dutch lose his mind, looking for her for 3 days. "Where did you get that dog?" the man said. It was not a hard question. It was barely a question at all. "I found her on the highway," Theo said. His voice was hoarse from the heat. 3 days ago. "I've been trying to find who she belongs to. The number on her tag doesn't work anymore." He held the collar out, the worn tag, the proof of 3 days of walking. "She had somebody, I could tell. She's too good a dog to not have had somebody." The man at the door turned and called one name back into the roadhouse, and the noise of 40 conversations stopped at once. Dutch Halloran came through that doorway like a man walking in a dream, and when the shepherd saw him, she came up off the gravel on her bad leg and made a sound no one in that lot would forget. And Dutch went down on his knees in the dirt and put his arms around that dog, and his shoulders shook. And 40 hardened men stood in the Arizona dusk and looked at the ground or the sky, or anywhere but at a grown man weeping into the fur of a dog he thought he'd lost. When Dutch finally looked up, he looked at the boy, the dirty, sunburned, swaying boy who was so hungry he was holding the door frame to stay upright. "You found her 3 days ago," Dutch said slowly, "and you've been trying to find me this whole time." "Yes, sir," Theo said. "You walked her. In this heat, you fed her." Dutch's eyes moved over the boy, the taped sneakers, the shaking hands, the way a child looks when he has given his own food away. "When did you last eat, son?" Theo looked at the ground and didn't answer, and that was the answer. And that was the moment the whole thing turned, because Dutch Halloran asked the boy a simple question, and the answer broke something open in that whole roadhouse. "Who do you belong to?" Dutch asked. "Who do I call to tell them what you did?" And Theo, very quietly, still looking at the ground, said, "Nobody. I'm at the county home. They won't have noticed I'm gone yet. We have 3 days before anybody checks." The roadhouse went so quiet that the only sound was the wind moving across the desert outside. 3 days. He had given 3 days that no one would have missed, to return a dog to a stranger, because a boy who had lost everything could not bear to let one more good thing get lost. 40 men stood in that silence and did the math on what kind of life teaches a 10-year-old that he has 3 days before anyone notices he is gone. Dutch stood up. He looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked at the men around him, his brothers, and something passed between all of them without a word, the way it does with men who have ridden a long time together. And Dutch took out his phone, and he made one call to the charter president 2 charters over, and all he said into it was 6 words. "There's a kid we need to thank." The thing about a call like that, and a brotherhood like that, is that it does not stay small. The charter president made his own calls. Those calls made more. Word went down the desert highways through the night, charter to charter, the way it does. And the word was simple. An orphan gave 3 days he didn't have to bring Dutch's dog home, and 3 days is all that boy thought his life was worth to anybody, and we are going to show him different. 409 motorcycles came up the gravel road to the Coronado County Children's Home as the sun came up over the desert. They did not race, and they did not roar. They came in slow and ordered, headlights fading as the sky went gold, chrome catching the first light, rank after rank, the way men come when somebody has put out a call and not one of them stopped to wonder whether they should answer it. They filled the gravel road and the dusty lot and lined the chain-link fence, 400 strong. And then, row by row, the engines died. And then there was silence. The silence of 400 riders standing outside a desert group home at dawn is not a thing you can describe to someone who has never stood inside it. It is heavier than any noise. The staff came out onto the steps in their wrinkled overnight clothes, not understanding. 60 children pressed their faces to the windows. And out in the gold morning light, 400 riders stood without making a sound, and Sadie the shepherd sat at the front of them all beside Dutch, ears up, watching the door. Theo came out onto the steps in his taped sneakers, blinking in the light, the photograph pressed flat in his shirt pocket, and he stopped dead at the sight of 400 motorcycles and 400 men standing in the road for a reason he could not begin to guess. Dutch came forward, and beside him came the charter president, an old man gray all the way through his beard, slow with the years, and he did not address the staff, and he did not address the crowd. He crouched down on the steps, all the way down, so a 10-year-old would not have to look up at one more towering adult, and his rough voice came out soft. "You, Theo?" he asked. The boy nodded, gripping the doorframe. "We heard what you did." The old man's weathered face came apart at the edges. 400 of us rode through the night to come here this morning, son. And you want to know why? Because you gave 3 days to bring a brother's dog home. And somewhere along the way, you got the idea that 3 days was about all your life was worth to anybody. He shook his head slowly. You got that wrong. You got that as wrong as a boy can get a thing. So we came to fix it. Every one of us. You are not nobody. You never were. Behind him, 400 riders stood without a sound. And then, quietly, Sadie the shepherd got up and crossed the gravel and climbed the steps and pressed herself against the boy's legs, the way a dog does when it has decided where it belongs. Theo put both arms around the dog's neck and finally, after 2 years of keeping his head down and wanting nothing, A 10-year-old orphan stood on the steps of a county home and cried in front of 400 strangers who had ridden through the night to tell him he mattered. What the Hells Angels did next was the part the town would talk about for years, and it was not a single grand gesture, but 100 quiet ones. The charter set up a fund that morning the way they do, and it did not stop at covering a few months. They worked with the home, and with the kind of lawyers who know how these things are done, and they made sure that boy had what he had been missing for 2 years, which was somebody in his corner with the time and the will to fight for him. There were riders who came back every weekend after that. There were birthday cards and school supplies, and a man who taught him to change the oil on a bike, and a charter that quietly made a small, frightened orphan into something he had not been since the accident, which was the most looked-after kid in the county. And Dutch Halloran did the thing that mattered most. He did not ride off and forget the boy who had walked 3 days for him. He kept coming back every week, and one afternoon, months on, he came back with paperwork that had taken every favor he had and a stubbornness the whole charter had thrown its weight behind. It was not simple. The system never is. But Dutch Halloran, 51 years old, who had spent 30 years thinking a dog was all the family a man like him would ever get, became the legal guardian of a 10-year-old boy. And Theo went home to a small house at the edge of the desert, where a shepherd named Sadie met him at the door every single afternoon. The first thing Theo asked for the first night in that house was whether he was allowed to keep the photograph out on the dresser where he could see it. He had kept it in his pocket for 2 years because in a place with 60 children, the only safe place for a precious thing was hidden. Dutch found him a frame. They put it on the dresser together. 2 people and a smaller boy on one side of the glass, and on the other side, propped beside it, a new photo somebody had taken that morning in the gold light of a boy and an old dog and 400 motorcycles. Some people think the most generous thing a person can give is money, or things the stuff a wallet can hold. They are wrong. The most generous thing this desert ever saw was an orphan with nothing of his own giving away 3 days and his only sandwich and the last of his strength to bring a stranger's dog home, simply because he could not stand to see one more good thing get lost. If this story reached you, if you believe that the people with the least to give are so often the ones who give the most, hit that like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no act of kindness is ever truly lost. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, has a stray animal or a stranger ever changed the whole direction of your life? I read every single one.